He chose me over my sisters. I wasn't the beautiful one, or the loudest. I was just the quiet girl who spent her days in the basement library, breathing in the scent of deteriorating bindings and forgotten histories. But when he looked at my name on a sheet of paper, he didn't see a stranger. He saw a secret my adoptive parents had spent 20 years trying to bury. The morning the lawyer arrived at the Vance household, the air in our home was already thick with the sour metallic scent of desperation. Richard Vance, the man who had raised me as a strict transactional obligation, was pacing the length of the formal dining room. His polished leather shoes clicked relentlessly against the hardwood, a frantic metronome ticking down the hours until his creditors finally broke through the front door. I was not upstairs with the rest of the family. I was in the subterranean chill of the estate's archive room, sitting at a scarred wooden table. My fingers were carefully smoothing the edges of a stack of vintage cataloging cards. They were heavy, cream-colored, and smelled faintly of dry ink and dust. I found a strange, grounding peace in organizing things that had been discarded. It was the only way I knew how to make sense of a world that treated me as an afterthought. The heavy oak door at the top of the basement stairs swung open, shattering the quiet. Sharp, aggressive footsteps echoed down the wooden steps. I didn't need to look up to know who it was. The cloying, artificial scent of synthetic rose, perfume hit the back of my throat long before Victoria Bertrand stepped into the dim light. My sisters were a matched set of superficial perfection, all glossy hair and sharp, judgmental angles. They hated the basement. They hated the dust, the lack of mirrors, and mostly, they hated that I found comfort in a place they considered a tomb. "Mother wants you upstairs," Victoria announced, her voice echoing off the stone walls. She didn't look at me. She was too busy inspecting the cuff of her silk blouse, her expression pinched with distaste. "I'm in the middle of indexing the Eastern Wings ledger," I replied softly, my gaze remaining fixed on the rough texture of the card in my hand. Beatrice stepped forward, her heel catching on the edge of the worn rug. Frustration, born from the mounting panic upstairs, flared in her dark eyes. She reached out and snatched the small wooden box of cataloging cards right off the table. "Tell me to stop," she challenged, her voice tight, holding the box over the edge of the desk. I didn't speak. I just watched her. With a sharp, contemptuous flick of her wrist, Beatrice overturned the box. The cards cascaded to the floor in a chaotic flutter of cream paper. Victoria let out a short, hollow laugh, her heel deliberately pressing down onto one of the older, fragile indices, tearing it straight down the middle. I didn't weep. I didn't scream. I didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Instead, I calmly pushed my chair back, the wood scraping against the stone floor. I knelt beside the scattered mess and began to gather the pieces. I swept the torn paper up into my palms, feeling the jagged edges against my skin, and pressed them flat inside the cover of my personal ledger. Choices vanish quickly when you're poor, when you are left motherless, and when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. My biological mother was just a hazy shadow in my mind, a ghost I wasn't allowed to mourn in this house, but her absence was a quiet ache I carried in my chest every single day. I closed the ledger, the heavy leather binding securing the broken pieces, safely inside. 5 minutes, I said without turning around. I heard the sharp, dismissive huffs of their breath before they turned and marched back up the stairs, leaving behind a trail of crushed paper and lingering synthetic rose. When I finally ascended to the main parlor, the atmosphere was suffocating. Eleanor Vance sat rigidly on the velvet sofa, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Richard had stopped pacing and was now standing by the fireplace, staring at a man seated calmly in a high-backed armchair. The stranger was dressed in a dark, immaculate suit. He held a sleek leather briefcase on his lap, and he exuded an aura of profound, clinical silence. He wasn't a creditor, but he held the same absolute power over the room. "Mr. Thorncroft is prepared to clear the entirety of the Vance estate's current liabilities," the lawyer said, his voice smooth and devoid of any emotional inflection. He placed a thick, wax-sealed envelope onto the low glass table. "The transaction will be finalized upon the signing of this marriage proposal." Richard's eyes widened. A sudden, gritty light seared panic on his face. He looked instantly toward Victoria, who was already standing a little taller, smoothing the front of her expensive skirt, preparing to step into the role of a billionaire's savior bride. "We are incredibly honored," my adoptive father breathed out, taking a step toward the table. "Victoria is—" "Not Victoria," the lawyer interrupted, his tone remaining perfectly flat. He didn't even look at the eldest daughter. His gaze shifted, cutting through the heavy tension of the parlor, and landed squarely on me, where I stood quietly in the doorway. "Mr. Thorncroft has specifically requested the hand of Sophia." The room plunged into absolute stunned silence. Eleanor let out a sharp gasp, her hand flying to her chest as if she had been physically struck. Beatrice stared at me with open, vitriolic disbelief. Richard's jaw slackened, his eyes darting between the lawyer and the quiet archivist standing in the shadows. "There must be a mistake," Eleanor finally managed to say, her voice trembling with indignation. "Sophia is. She is not suited for public life. She isn't even truly." "There is no mistake," the lawyer stated, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "The offer is absolute. If Miss Sophia signs, the debts vanish by morning. If she does not, the banks will take this house by noon tomorrow. The choice is entirely hers." Every eye in the room turned to me. I felt the immense crushing weight of their collective desperation pressing down on my shoulders. I looked at the heavy ledgers, stacked on Richard's desk, and then at the cold, unyielding face of the lawyer. I didn't know Alistair Thorncroft. I only knew his name. A titan of Pacific Northwest shipping. A man who lived like a recluse in a stone fortress by the sea. I didn't ask questions. I walked across the parlor, picking up the silver fountain pen resting beside the document. I didn't read the terms. I simply signed my name, my handwriting small, precise, and entirely devoid of hesitation. It was a transaction. I was settling a debt I hadn't accrued, paying for the thin roof that had been kept over my head. 3 hours later, I was gone. No one waved as the dark car pulled away from the Vance estate. I sat in the back seat, staring out the tinted glass as the city melted away, replaced by the towering, skeletal silhouettes of ancient pines and the deep, churning gray of the winter ocean. The drive took hours. The further we went, the more the world seemed to quiet down. The frantic, superficial noise of my past life was swallowed by the immense, heavy presence of the coastline. I watched the rain begin to beat against the cold glass, separating me entirely from everything I had ever known. By the time the car finally slowed, the light had faded into a deep, bruised twilight. The tires crunched slowly over a long, winding gravel driveway. Through the rain-streaked window, I saw it. The Thorncroft estate was less of a house, and more of an architectural monument to isolation. It was built of dark, salt-stained stone and heavy crescent glass, anchored directly into the rugged cliffs facing the Pacific. It looked like a fortress designed to keep the entire world out. The car stopped near the grand entryway. The driver opened my door, and the biting sea wind immediately lashed against my skin, carrying the sharp, clean scent of crushed pine needles, cold water, and wet earth. I stepped out, pulling my thin cardigan tighter around my chest. There, standing on the broad stone steps beneath the iron awning, was my new husband. Alistair Thorncroft was a towering, imposing figure. He wore a heavy charcoal wool overcoat, his broad shoulders blocking the coastal wind. His face was carved with the harsh lines of a man who had weathered decades of storms, both literal and metaphorical. His dark hair was brushed with silver, and his eyes, a deep, unreadable storm gray, were fixed entirely on me. He didn't look at me the way Richard did, assessing my value. He didn't look at me the way my sisters did, searching for flaws to mock. He looked at me with a startling, quiet intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a look of profound, unwavering recognition. I stood frozen at the base of the steps, my arms wrapped around myself, violently shivering as a gust of frigid air tore off the ocean. I expected him to close the distance. I expected the overbearing gesture of a powerful man claiming his new asset, perhaps draping his coat over my shoulders to force a physical proximity I hadn't consented to. Instead, Alistair simply held my gaze. Slowly, he unbuttoned his thick, dark coat. He slipped it off his broad shoulders, holding the heavy fabric in his hands for a fraction of a second. Then, without taking a single step toward me, he turned and draped the warm garment over a wrought iron peg mounted just inside the massive, open oak doors. He stepped back, leaving the entrance clear. He had offered the warmth, but he had left the choice to me. He was giving me physical space, honoring my boundaries before a single word had been spoken. "The wind is brutal tonight," he murmured. His voice was deep, resonant, and entirely devoid of arrogance. It sounded like the low rumble of the ocean itself. "Take it if you need it." "The fires are already lit inside." I stared at the empty space between us, analyzing the massive, silent respect in his gesture. Slowly, I walked up the stone steps. I didn't put the coat on, but as I passed it, I let my fingertips brush against the heavy, warm wool. It smelled intensely of cedarwood, sea salt, and old paper, a scent that immediately lowered the defensive walls I had kept up for 20 years. I crossed the threshold into the grand hall. The interior of the house was a stunning contrast to the wild storm outside. It was warm, lit by the soft amber glow of wall sconces and a massive stone fireplace. The silence here wasn't the tense, suffocating quiet of the Vance household. This silence was different. It felt like a held breath, a deep, ancient peace that settled immediately into my bones. Alistair stepped inside behind me, pulling the thick wooden panels shut, sealing out the storm and the roar of the ocean. He stood a respectful distance away, his hands resting easily at his sides. "Welcome home, Sophia," he whispered, the quiet words cutting straight through the chill in my blood. "You are exactly where you belong." I looked up at the towering bookshelves lining the upper gallery, then back to the stoic, trauma-walled protector standing before me. I didn't know what this man wanted from me. I didn't know why he had paid a fortune for a quiet archivist he had never met. But as the scent of cedarwood wrapped around me in the warm air, I realized something profound. Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence, and for the first time in my life, I felt the terrifying, irresistible pull to answer. Morning came quietly. No trumpets. No shift in the universe, just a pale beam of winter light, slipping through the tall crescent windows, brushing against my shoulder like a second thought. The storm that had raged against the Pacific cliffs all night had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world that felt thoroughly washed clean. I lay in the center of the massive, canopy-draped bed, staring up at the carved wooden ceiling. The air in the guest chamber was crisp, carrying the faint, bracing chill of the ocean, yet I was entirely enveloped in the heavy warmth of down comforters and thick cotton sheets. For a long time, I did not move. I simply listened. At the Vance household, mornings were a chaotic symphony of demands. There would be the sharp clatter of porcelain as Eleanor ordered the staff around, the frantic pacing of my adoptive father in his study, and the shrill complaints of my sisters, echoing through the drafty corridors. I was usually awake hours before them, confined to the basement, indexing the household inventories just to justify the cost of my meals. But here, within the thick stone walls of the Thorncroft estate, the silence was absolute. It was not the tense, suffocating quiet of a family holding its breath before an argument. It was the deep, resonant stillness of a sanctuary. I pushed the covers aside and stepped onto the thick woven rug. On the heavy oak bedside table, resting perfectly centered beneath the soft glow of a brass lamp, lay a single, forged iron key. Beside it was a small piece of thick, cream-colored stationery. The handwriting on the note was sharp, angular, and entirely devoid of unnecessary flourish. It read, "The Eastern Wing is yours. Do with it as you see fit." There were no instructions. There were no demands for a morning meeting, no schedules dictating when I was expected to appear in the grand hall. Alistair had brought me into his home, settled a fortune in debt to secure my presence, and his first act was to hand me the keys to a locked room and step away. He was giving me the one thing I had never possessed: unbroken, unmonitored space. I dressed quickly in a simple, heavy wool sweater and a long skirt I found waiting in the wardrobe, the fabric soft and practical, lacking the stiff, superficial glamour my sisters favored. Taking the iron key in my hand, I left the bedroom and walked down the long, shadowed corridor toward the eastern wing. The stone floors were cold through my thin slippers, but the air grew progressively warmer, scented with the faint, comforting aroma of wood smoke drifting from unseen hearths. I reached the end of the hall, standing before a pair of towering mahogany doors. The wood was dark and ancient, carved with intricate, twisting vines that seemed to grow upward toward the ceiling. I slid the heavy iron key into the brass lock. It turned with a satisfying, metallic clank, a sound that felt like the dropping of a chain. I pushed the doors open. The breath completely left my lungs. I stepped over the threshold into a cathedral of forgotten history. The archive room was massive, spanning 2 full stories of the estate's eastern wing. Towering bookshelves made of dark, polished wood lined every available inch of the walls, stretching upward toward a vaulted ceiling. Wrought iron spiral staircases connected the lower floor to a wraparound gallery above. The entire far wall was constructed of heavy, leaded glass, offering a sweeping, unobstructed view of the churning gray ocean and the jagged coastline below. The light in the room was spectacular, cool, silvery, and deeply serene, illuminating thousands of leather-bound spines, stacked ledgers, and overflowing folio boxes. It did not smell of decay or neglect. It smelled of careful preservation. The distinct, dry aroma of aging vellum, pressed leaves, and faint sea salt hung in the air like a physical presence. I walked slowly into the center of the room, my fingertips trailing lightly over the edge of a long, velvet-lined reading table. Resting at the center of the desk was a heavy brass magnifying glass, its handle wrapped in worn leather. Beside it sat a delicate porcelain cup and saucer. A thin ribbon of steam was rising from the cup. I stepped closer, wrapping my cold hands around the fragile porcelain. The warmth seeped instantly into my palms. It was chamomile tea, steeped to perfection, carrying a faint trace of local honey. It was entirely fresh. The stoic man who owned this fortress had come in here before dawn, arranged the reading desk, placed the tea, and left before I could even wake. Not to boast, not to demand gratitude, just to ensure the space was welcoming when I finally arrived. True devotion rarely announces its arrival. It simply prepares a place for you to rest. I took a slow sip of the warm tea, letting the soothing liquid calm the residual trembling in my chest. For 20 years I had been treated as a burden, a transactional mistake that Richard and Eleanor merely tolerated. I had been relegated to a damp, lightless basement, told that my quiet nature was a flaw, a liability that made me entirely unsuited for the bright, wealthy world they desperately clung to. Yet here, in the home of one of the most powerful tycoons on the coast, my quietness was not just accepted, it was revered. Alistair had built an entire world specifically designed to honor the way my mind worked. I set the cup down and began to explore the lower shelves. The collection was staggering. There were maritime logs dating back 2 centuries, architectural blueprints of the coastal towns, and extensive genealogical records of the families who had built empires in the Pacific Northwest. I pulled a heavy ledger from the shelf, feeling the satisfying weight of the leather binding in my hands. The spine cracked softly as I opened it, revealing pages of meticulous, handwritten ink. For the entirety of my first week, I lost myself completely in the rhythm of the archives. The profound silence of the room became a healing balm to my frayed nerves. I didn't have to look over my shoulder. I didn't have to brace myself for a cruel comment, the sharp snap of Eleanor's silk fan, or a sudden, demanding order from Richard to fetch his ledger. I was simply allowed to exist. The days fell into a steady, hypnotic cadence. Outside the heavy leaded glass of the eastern wing, the Pacific winter raged relentlessly, sending sheets of gray rain and bitter sea foam lashing against the dark stone cliffs. But inside, I was insulated by ancient architecture, the scent of aging vellum, and a physical warmth that slowly seeped into my very bones. My days were spent cataloging, running my hands over the spines of history, building a mental map of Alistair Thorncroft's legacy. I mended torn pages with delicate archival tape, breathing life back into forgotten shipping manifests and old poetry collections. I was no longer fighting for the right to take up space. I was preserving it, and my evenings became something else entirely. At the Vance household, the setting of the sun always marked the beginning of the most dangerous hours. It meant forced dinners, where I was expected to remain invisible, or sharp-tongued interrogations about my perceived social failures, while Victoria and Beatrice paraded in their new silks. But at the Thorncroft estate, the twilight brought a different kind of ritual. On the 3rd night of my residence, I was sitting by the grand stone hearth in the center of the archive room, a heavy woolen blanket pulled tightly over my knees. The fire was burning low, the embers casting a deep, flickering amber light across the polished floorboards. I was deeply engrossed in a collection of 19th century botanical sketches when I heard the soft, deliberate sound of the heavy mahogany doors opening. I flinched automatically, my shoulders tensing as I braced for a reprimand. But it was only Alistair. He had removed his formal suit jacket, wearing only a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing the corded muscle and faint silver scars that spoke of a life spent working on the brutal docks before he ever owned them. He carried a small stack of leather-bound ledgers in one hand and a simple, unadorned iron fireplace poker in the other. He looked exactly like the stone walls of his estate, immovable, heavy, and deeply protective. He did not demand my attention. He did not ask what I was doing or insist that I entertain him. He simply walked to the hearth, his heavy boots making absolutely no sound on the thick rugs, and knelt beside the fading fire. With slow, methodical movements, he stoked the dying embers, adding 3 thick logs of dried cedar. The wood caught immediately, sending a shower of golden sparks up the dark chimney and releasing that rich, grounding aroma of burning cedar that I was quickly learning to associate entirely with him. When the fire was roaring again, casting a generous wave of heat across the cold stone room, Alistair stood up. He walked to a heavy leather wingback chair situated on the opposite side of the hearth, sat down and opened his ledger. He didn't speak a single word. For over 2 hours, we simply sat together in the warmth of the fire. The only sounds in the massive room were the crackle of the burning logs, the heavy drumming of the rain against the glass, and the soft, intermittent turning of our respective pages. The silence between us was not the tense, suffocating quiet of a family holding its breath before a violent argument. It was a shared sanctuary. It was the deep, resonant stillness of 2 people who had spent their entire lives building heavy defensive walls, finally realizing they did not need to wear their armor in the same room. By the end of the 2nd week, that evening routine had become the absolute anchor of my existence. Alistair's presence ceased to be a source of anxiety and became a profound source of emotional security. I began to look forward to the subtle click of the mahogany doors at dusk. I began to anticipate the fragrance of the wood smoke clinging to his clothes. I noticed the small, silent acts of service he left in his wake, realizing that this stoic man spoke his vows purely through the work of his hands. If I left a stack of heavy boxes on a top shelf, unable to lift them down, I would return the next morning to find them safely lowered to the reading desk. If the draft from the western window grew too sharp during a particularly brutal storm, I would find a thick knitted cashmere throw draped carefully over the back of my chair. He never mentioned these things, and I never thanked him aloud, understanding instinctively that to draw attention to his vulnerability would be to force him to retreat. We were communicating in the only language either of us truly trusted, the undeniable proof of consistent action. As the days melted into the first full month of our marriage, the winter tightened its icy grip on the coastline. The estate was frequently locked in by heavy, blinding fall that turned the world outside into a pale, shifting void. I had systematically catalogued nearly the entire lower floor of the archives. I knew the placement of every maritime map, every architectural draft, and every philosophical treatise Alistair had collected. But there was one specific section of the room I had not yet breached. In the deepest, most shadowed corner of the eastern wing, tucked behind a towering row of naval history encyclopedias, was a heavy iron gate built directly into the stone wall. Behind the gate was a small secondary alcove, an inner sanctum of the collection. Through the iron bars, I could see a single, beautifully carved mahogany display cabinet. The gate was secured by an ancient, heavy brass padlock. It was the only locked door within the sanctuary Alistair had given me. For weeks, I had respected the boundary. I had assumed it held private family ledgers, perhaps the financial records of the Thorncroft shipping empire, things that a newly acquired, debt-bound bride had no business reviewing. But as the days turned into a month, and the quiet trust between Alistair and me deepened in the warmth of the firelight, my archivist's curiosity began to gnaw at my restraint. The shift came on the 31st day of my time at the estate. Alistair had left the archives earlier than usual the night before, called away by an urgent telegram from the harbor master. In his haste, he had left his own reading ledger on the small table beside his leather wingback chair. When I arrived in the archive room the next morning, The space was colder than usual, the hearth completely dark and empty. I walked over to his chair, intending to move his ledger so I could dust the table. As I picked up the heavy, worn book, a small, cold object slipped from between the pages and clattered onto the wooden floorboards. I looked down. Resting against the dark wood was a small, heavy brass key. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the key, then looked across the vast expanse of the room toward the shadowed corner where the iron gate stood. It was not a mistake. A man like Alistair Thorncroft, a man who built empires on absolute precision, did not simply drop the key to his most private sanctum and forget it. He had left it for me. He was quietly opening another door, waiting to see if I had the courage to walk through it. I knelt and picked up the key. The metal was heavy and cold against my palm. I held it tightly, my heart beginning to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs as I walked slowly across the archive room. The ambient light of the winter morning grew dimmer as I moved into the eastern alcove, the towering bookshelves blocking out the pale rays of the sun. I stood before the heavy iron gate, the padlock hung perfectly still in the quiet air. I slid the key into the mechanism. It turned with a smooth, oiled click that sounded deafening in the silence of the room. I slipped the padlock free, unlooped it from the iron latch, and pushed the heavy gate open. It swung inward without a single creak. I stepped over the threshold into the inner sanctum. The space was incredibly small, designed only to hold the single mahogany cabinet. But, as I crossed the boundary, a new scent cut through the dry, dusty aroma of aging vellum and sea salt. It was faint at first, a mere suggestion carried on the heavy draft of the old stone walls. I closed my eyes and breathed in deeply. It was the rich, sweet aroma of aged beeswax, mingled with the sharp, medicinal clarity of lavender oil. My eyes snapped open, a violent jolt of pure, static shock traveling down my spine. It was a scent that did not belong in a collection of maritime history. It was a domestic scent, intimate and deeply personal. More than that, it was a scent that triggered a sudden, brutal ache in the very center of my chest. It was a ghost. It was the singular, hazy memory I had of the woman who had brought me into the world before fading entirely into the dark, leaving me to the mercy of Richard and Eleanor Vance. I stepped closer to the mahogany cabinet. The glass doors were not locked. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly, as I grasped the brass handles and pulled them open. The shelves inside did not hold shipping ledgers or property deeds. They held an assortment of carefully preserved personal artifacts. There was a delicate silver pocket watch, a pair of worn leather reading gloves, and a stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon. But my eyes were drawn immediately to the center shelf, where a rectangular bundle wrapped in thick, midnight blue velvet rested in solitary reverence. The fabric was immaculate, untouched by the dust that blanketed the rest of the world. It had been placed here with absolute, heartbreaking care. I reached into the cabinet. The scent of lavender and beeswax was overwhelmingly strong now, rising directly from the velvet folds. I gripped the bundle and pulled it out into the dim light of the alcove. It was heavy, carrying the dense, undeniable weight of a bound manuscript. I sank slowly to the floor of the inner sanctum, my heavy wool skirt pooling around my knees on the cold stone. The silence of the archive room seemed to press inward, the entire house holding its breath. As I gently laid the bundle on my lap, I slowly unfolded the velvet fabric, peeling back the layers to reveal what Alistair had kept hidden in the dark. The cloth fell away. Revealed in the fractured light was a thick, leather-bound diary. The leather was a deep, rich cordovan, its edges worn soft and smooth from years of being held. It smelled fiercely of the beeswax used to condition the cover and the lavender oil that had been pressed into its pages. Binding the cover to the back panel was a thick, heavy strap of leather, secured not by a metal clasp, but by a massive, unbroken pool of dark red wax. The wax seal was pristine. It had not been disturbed in decades. Pressed deeply into the center of the dark red circle was an intricate custom crest. A stylized, sweeping letter S, flanked by two delicate fern fronds. Sterling. My breath hitched a sharp, ragged sound that shattered the absolute quiet of the alcove. My biological mother's maiden name. The name Richard and Eleanor had forbidden me from ever speaking aloud. The name that had been systematically erased from my childhood, replaced only by the heavy, suffocating dead of the Vance family. I stared at the red wax, my hands shaking violently as the profound weight of the object settled over me. This was not a forgotten maritime law. This was a voice locked away in the dark. Attached to the leather, binding by a thin, silken thread, was a small, cream-colored tag. The ink on the tag was a faded, melancholic sepia, but the handwriting was unmistakable. The strokes were pressed deeply into the paper, that's crossed with fierce, protective slashes, and the loops of the E's carrying the slight smudges of a hand, moving too fast. I traced the fragile, heavy letters with a trembling index finger. I knew this handwriting. I had seen it once, on a single torn scrap of paper hidden in the lining of an old coat, before Eleanor had found it and burned it in the parlor fireplace. It was the handwriting of Clara Sterling. My eyes blurred, the pale winter light fracturing through the sudden hot tears that filled my vision. I didn't break the seal. I didn't dare to snap the fragile red wax that had guarded her secrets for so many years. I simply clutched the heavy leather diary to my chest, burying my face in the velvet as the first, silent sob finally tore its way out of my throat. The man who had offered me a contract to settle a debt had not simply given me an archive to manage. He had given me a map to my own stolen past. And sitting there, surrounded by the blend of fragrant wood, beeswax, and ancient paper, I realized that the true mystery of the Thorncroft estate was only just beginning. I did not move from the floor of the alcove. The cold from the stones seeped through my heavy wool skirt, numbing my knees, but I barely registered the chill. My trembling fingers hovered over the dark red wax, binding the leather strap. For 20 years, the Vance family had told me I was nothing, a charity case, an unwanted burden left behind by a forgotten relative. Breaking this seal meant shattering the only reality I had ever known. I pressed my thumb against the center of the sterling crest. The wax was brittle with decades of untouched silence. It snapped with a sharp, dry crack that echoed in the tiny sanctum, the dark red fragments falling onto the midnight blue velvet like drops of hardened clay. I opened the heavy cordovan cover. The intense, preserved aroma of lavender and old paper rushed up to meet me, bringing with it a wave of somatic sorrow so pure it stole the breath from my lungs. The first page was thick and heavily textured, the ink a faded, melancholic sepia. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, the words pressing so deeply into the paper that they left permanent physical ridges on the reverse side, as if the writer knew her time was running out. "My sweet Sophia," the first line read. I stopped. A ragged, entirely ungraceful gasp tore from my throat. No one in the Vance household had ever called me sweet. I was always the girl, the archivist, the obligation. Eleanor had looked at me with thinly veiled disgust, while Richard only saw a number on a balance sheet. Victoria and Beatrice had made a sport of my quietness, tearing up my catalog cards in the damp basement of my youth, mocking my every attempt to carve out a small corner of peace. To see my own name anchored to a word of endearment, written by the hand of the woman who bore me, unraveled decades of tightly wound armor in a single second. I dragged my fingertips over the dry ink, tracing the sweeping loops of the letters, pretending, for just a fractured moment, that I was touching her hand. The paper felt thick, handmade, carrying the weight of a maternal legacy that had been deliberately stolen from me. I forced myself to read on, my eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the crescent window. The diary was not a daily log of trivial events. It was a desperate confession, a ledger of truths meant to survive a coming darkness. Clara Sterling wrote of her failing health, a slow, wasting illness that the coastal doctors could not name. She wrote of Richard Vance, her late husband's cousin, and the cold, methodical way he was isolating her from the family's attorneys, dismissing her loyal servants, and shutting her inside the grand estate that was rightfully hers. He is altering the heritage ledgers, the sepia ink revealed, the strokes turning sharp and frantic across the parchment. He intends to take the Sterling estate the moment I am gone, and he intends to take you, to control the inheritance until you come of age. They will bury your true name, my darling. They will strip away your history and try to make you forget who you are. A cold, violently clear fury began to replace the sorrow in my chest. It was not a loud, chaotic anger, but a quiet, freezing realization. The crushing debts, the damp basement, the constant, suffocating humiliation. It had all been built on a foundation of absolute theft. The torn catalog cards, and the cruel mockery of my sisters were not just the products of a dysfunctional household. They were calculated strategies designed to break my spirit before I could ever question my origins. Richard had not saved me from ruin. He had imprisoned me inside my own stolen life. He had commodified the very child he had robbed, using me to pay off the debts he accrued with my mother's money. I turned another fragile page, the paper rustling like dry leaves in the quiet alcove. The scent of lavender seemed to intensify, a phantom embrace across the chasm of 20 years. But I am not leaving you completely defenseless. My mother's handwriting continued, the words shifting into a tone of fierce, desperate hope. There is a boy on the harbor docks. A rough, quiet boy with silver scars on his arms and a mind sharper than cut glass. I taught him to read when the world threw him away. His name is Alistair Thorncroft. I have made him swear a vow. If you are reading this, my sweet girl, Alistair has kept you safe from those who took you. I closed the diary, the heavy leather covers coming together with a heavy final thud. The sound reverberated through the iron gate of the sanctum, echoing up into the vaulted ceiling of the massive library. The silence of the archive room pressed inward, thick and suffocating, before shattering entirely as the sheer gravity of the revelation took hold. The man who had paid my adoptive father's massive debts had not purchased a bride. He had not sought a transaction to expand his shipping empire or secure a docile companion for his isolated estate. He had executed a 20-year rescue mission. The marriage contract was a shield. Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. There are havens in this world that speak to the soul without ever making a sound. This archive had called to me from the moment I arrived, a sanctuary preparing for my return. I carried the velvet-wrapped diary out of the shadowed alcove, locking the heavy iron gate behind me with the brass key. I walked slowly back out into the main expanse of the archives, my legs feeling weak, completely unmoored from the gravity I had always known. The polished stone floor seemed to sway beneath my feet as I approached the grand stone hearth. I knelt on the thick woven rug, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip the iron poker, but I built the fire myself. I stacked the dried cedar logs methodically, striking a long match and watching the golden sparks catch in the rough, peeling bark. A familiar wood smoke fragrance began to fill the massive room, rising with the heat and wrapping around me like a physical shield against the cold reality of my past. I pulled my heavy woolen blanket over my shoulders, retreating into the deep embrace of my designated reading chair, and I waited for the sun to sink beneath the churning Pacific horizons. Dusk fell slowly over the Thorncroft estate, painting the towering leaded glass in shades of bruised purple and deep charcoal. The winter rain began to beat against the crescent windows, a steady, rhythmic drumming that isolated the eastern wing from the rest of the world. The storm outside mirrored the tempest within my own mind, but in the warmth of the firelight, I remained entirely still. Then, just as the antique grandfather clock in the hall chimed the hour, I heard it. The soft, deliberate click of the mahogany doors opening at the far end of the hall. Alistair stepped into the archives. He wore his thick, dark coat, his broad shoulders damp from the coastal storm, his dark hair plastered against his forehead. The faint scent of ozone, rain, and cold sea air drifted into the room with him. He stopped just inside the doorway. His sharp, tempest-colored gaze swept across the vast room, taking in the roaring fire, my rigid posture in the chair, and finally, the midnight blue velvet resting heavily on my knees. He did not flinch. He did not look surprised, nor did he offer a frantic, melodramatic apology for keeping secrets. Instead, the rigid, immovable tension that always seemed to lock House shoulders in place suddenly dissolved. The stoic Tycoon looked profoundly, devastatingly tired, but completely at peace. It was the look of a man who had carried a mountain for 2 decades and was finally allowed to set it down. He walked slowly across the room, shedding his wet overcoat and draping it over the back of a wooden reading chair. The damp wool clung to his frame as he crossed the space to the hearth, but he did not sit in his own leather wingback chair. Instead, the towering shipping magnate sank to his knees on the thick rug, positioning himself perfectly at eye level with me. He was deliberately lowering himself, surrendering every ounce of his physical dominance before a single word was spoken. "You found her," he whispered, his deep voice barely audible over the crackle of the burning cedar. I gripped the edges of the diary, my knuckles turning white against the dark leather. "You knew," I said, my voice trembling, stripped of all its usual quiet composure. "You knew my mother. You knew what Richard did to her. What he did to me." Alistair bowed his head for a fraction of a second, the firelight catching the faint silver scars traversing his forearms. The very scars my mother had written about. Clara Sterling was the only person in this world who looked at a starving, half-wild dock boy and saw a human being, he said quietly, his tone heavy with absolute, unwavering reverence. I did not know what a warm meal was until she invited me into the Sterling kitchen. She taught me to read using old maritime logs. She gave me dignity when the harbor offered only cold rain and empty nights. He paused, the memory of her kindness anchoring the heavy silence between us. The rain lashed against the glass, a sharp contrast to the profound stillness inside the room. And when she realized she was dying, and that Richard Vance had already manipulated the local magistrates to secure forged guardianship papers, she summoned me. He lifted his gaze, meeting my tear-filled eyes with an intensity that burned straight through the chill in the room. I was 16, Sophia. I had no money, no title, and no power to fight a family that owned the courts. If I had tried to take you away, they would have used the law to crush us both, and you would have been locked away entirely. So, I knelt beside her bed, and I swore a vow. I swore that I would build a fortress so impenetrable and amass a fortune so massive that when the time came, Richard Vance would not be able to refuse me. The sheer scale of his silent devotion hit me like a physical blow. The years of isolation, the ruthless business acquisitions, the cold reputation he had built, all of it had been for this. All of it had been for me. Sometimes love doesn't knock, it waits. It waits for 20 years in the rain, building an empire just to offer it as a shield. The debt, I breathed out, the pieces of the puzzle snapping together with terrifying, awe-inspiring clarity. You did not just pay his debts, you engineered them. I bought every promissory note he ever signed. Alistair confirmed, his voice a low, steady rumble of uncompromising justice. I backed his creditors through blind trusts. I waited until he was suffocating, until the financial walls were entirely closed in. And then I offered him the only exit that existed. A marriage contract. He reached out, his large, calloused hand stopping just an inch from mine, refusing to cross the boundary without my explicit permission. Not because I wanted to own you, Sophia, but because a legal marriage was the absolute, uncontestable shield that would permanently sever his guardianship over you. It was the only way to extract you, without triggering a legal war that would expose the Sterling inheritance before you were ready to claim it. He had not bought me. He had bought my freedom. For 2 decades, this man had operated in the shadows, ruthlessly dismantling my abuser's empire while meticulously building a sanctuary specifically designed to hold my quiet nature. Every book in this archive, every log on the fire, every cup of tea left silently on my desk, it was all a continuation of a promise made to a dying woman. Alistair slowly pushed himself up from the floor. He walked over to the velvet-lined reading desk, his heavy boots silent on the antique rugs. From the inside pocket of his suit jacket, he withdrew a thick, heavy envelope. It was not sealed with wax, but with cold, official, legal steel. He broke the seal and pulled out 2 distinct stacks of heavy, cream-colored vellum. He carried them back to the hearth and gently placed them on the small wooden table between us. The first stack, he said, tapping the documents on the left, are the Sterling deeds. They are the original property ledgers, the authenticated signatures, and the exhaustive financial records proving Richard Vance committed fraud and embezzlement. I spent 10 years tracking down the corrupt magistrates he paid off, securing their silence and their written confessions. Your biological mother's estate was stolen. These papers legally restore the entirety of the Sterling fortune and the ancestral home directly to your name. Richard has no claim. He never did. I stared at the dense legal text, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The sheer magnitude of what he was handing me was incomprehensible. Before I could speak, my husband touched the second stack of vellum. These, he continued, his voice softening into a raw, vulnerable cadence that I had never heard before, are the deeds to the Thorncroft estate, the shipping lines, the harbor warehouses, this eastern wing, and the very stone beneath our feet. Slowly, Alistair reached down to his right hand. He gripped the heavy silver signet ring on his index finger, the singular symbol of his immense empire, the crest that commanded thousands of men across the Pacific Northwest. And he pulled it off. With absolute, unwavering reverence, he placed the silver ring directly in the center of the Thorncroft documents. He slid the entire arrangement across the polished wood until it rested against the edge of my chair. "I am only the steward," Alistair whispered, his slate irises completely stripped of their usual stoic armor, revealing a depth of devotion that stole the breath from my lungs. "The Sterling estate is your past. Thorncroft is your present. They are both in your name, and they both belong to you." He took one step back, giving me the physical space to process the absolute surrender of his empire. The firelight flickered across his face as he looked at me, a man who had conquered the world just to lay it quietly at my feet. The contract was never a cage. It was the key to my own kingdom. He had given me back my history, and in the same breath he had offered me his entire future, asking for nothing in return. "Write the life you want," he said softly, the words hanging in the warm, cedar-scented air, like a final vow. "I'll meet you there." I looked down at the massive fortune resting on the table, at the silver ring gleaming in the firelight, and then at the heavy leather diary in my lap. For my entire life, I had been told I was a forgotten daughter, an invisible pawn meant to be hidden in the dark. But sitting in the quiet warmth of the archives, surrounded by the undeniable proof of a 20-year silent sacrifice, I finally understood the truth. I was not an afterthought. I was the true heir. And the stoic protector standing before me had spent his entire life ensuring I would never have to bow my head to anyone ever again. The morning the Vance family arrived at Thorncroft Estate, the Pacific sky was a brilliant, unforgiving shade of winter blue. There were no storm clouds to soften the light, no heavy coastal fog to blur the edges of the world. It was a harsh, blinding clarity that left absolutely nowhere to hide. I was sitting in the grand hall, the heavy sterling deeds resting on my lap, when the sharp, aggressive strike of the brass door knocker shattered the morning quiet. Beside me, Alistair did not flinch. He simply set his porcelain teacup onto the saucer with a soft, definitive click, his intense gray gaze meeting mine. He did not offer to send them away. He did not step in front of me to shield me from the conflict. He understood that a shield was no longer what I required. I needed the space to swing my own sword. When the massive entrance doors were pulled open by the estate staff, the icy ocean wind rushed in, carrying with it a scent that immediately caused my stomach to tighten. It was the cloying, synthetic aroma of rose perfume, entirely artificial and desperately attempting to mask the sour metallic scent of greed. Richard and Eleanor Vance stepped over the threshold of the Thorncroft estate. They did not look like the imposing, terrifying figures of my childhood. Stripped of the psychological power they had held over me, they simply looked small. Richard's eyes immediately darted upward, taking in the towering stone columns, the vaulted ceilings, and the priceless tapestries lining the gallery. His gaze was entirely transactional, calculating the net worth of his adoptive daughter's new prison, assuming I was nothing more than a commodity that had finally paid off. Eleanor smoothed the front of her expensive velvet coat, her lips pinched in a tight, judgmental line as she took in the stark, unadorned elegance of the space. "Sophia," Richard announced, his voice echoing too loudly in the quiet hall, entirely devoid of genuine warmth. He strode forward, expecting me to rise, to bow my head, to shrink into the shadows as I always had. "We have driven for hours. Your husband's staff at the outer gate were incredibly difficult. One would think you were trying to keep your own family away." I did not stand. I remained seated in the high-backed leather chair, my hands resting lightly over the cream-colored vellum of the deeds. Alistair stood a few paces to my right, his shoulder leaning casually against the stone mantel of the unlit fireplace. He looked like a monolith of dark wool and quiet danger, his presence a silent, heavy anchor that kept my pulse perfectly steady. "You are not my family," I said. The words were not shouted. They were not delivered with dramatic fury or a trembling voice. They were spoken with the calm, flat cadence of an archivist, stating an undeniable historical fact. Richard halted, his polished shoes scuffing against the thick woven rug. A flash of genuine shock crossed his face, quickly replaced by the familiar, condescending irritation he had always used to force me into submission. Do not be ridiculous, Sophia. We are here to discuss the remaining terms of the arrangement. The initial debt clearance was a generous gesture, of course, but maintaining the Vance household requires a more permanent line of credit. Since you are now the mistress of this estate, it is only fair that you secure an allowance as for the parents, who sacrificed everything to raise you. He reached into his tailored jacket, preparing to pull out whatever fraudulent ledger he had concocted to justify his extortion. I did not let him finish the motion. I calmly lifted the top document from the stack on my lap, the heavy, steel-sealed legal disclaimer documents that Alistair's attorneys had finalized at dawn. I placed them onto the low mahogany table between us. There is no arrangement, I said quietly, the familiar woodsy scent rising from the fire logs beside me, grounding my focus. There is only the Sterling estate, which you embezzled for 20 years. And there are the sworn, written confessions of the local magistrates who helped you forge the guardianship papers after my biological mother died. The blood drained entirely from Richard's face, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray. His hand froze inside his jacket. The synthetic rose perfume suddenly seemed to curdle in the air as the crushing weight of his absolute ruin finally descended upon him. He stared at the documents, his eyes wide, with a terror he could not articulate. He realized, in a single, freezing second, that he was not standing in the home of a conquered bride. He was standing in the fortress of his executioner. Eleanor, sensing the catastrophic shift in the room's dynamic, immediately rushed forward. Her face twisted into a mask of desperate, frantic sorrow, attempting to play the one card she believed still held power over me. "Sophia, please," she cried, her voice trembling with forced maternal agony. She reached out, her heavily ringed fingers grasping toward my shoulder. "You cannot do this to us, after everything I did for you. I took you in when you had no one. I fed you. I clothed you. I treated you like my own daughter when the world would have thrown you to the streets. We gave you a home. This is how you pay me back," she hissed, the venom briefly breaking through her fragile facade. I looked at her outstretched hand, feeling absolutely nothing. The fear of her disapproval, the desperate childhood yearning for her affection. It had all evaporated, burned away by the truth, written in Clara Sterling's sepia ink. I reached into the leather portfolio resting beside my chair and withdrew a small worn book. It was an old adoption ledger, the very same one I had found in the basement archives of their home, where I had spent my life indexing their lies. I opened it to a heavily annotated page, where neat, precise columns of numbers marched down the margin. I slid it across the mahogany table, stopping it exactly in front of Eleanor's trembling fingers. "I have audited the exact cost of my existence in your house," I explained, my tone remaining perfectly clinical. "I calculated the price of the basement room. I factored in the meager meals, the threadbare clothing, and the electricity I used to read in the dark. I have subtracted the wages of the labor I provided by managing your household inventories." Eleanor stared at the ledger, her mouth opening and closing in mute horror as she looked at the cold, indisputable mathematics of her cruelty. "The balance you are owed is $3,400, I continued, withdrawing a certified bank draft from the portfolio and placing it directly on top of the ledger. "It has been paid in full from the reclaimed Sterling Trust. You have been compensated for every ounce of basic room and board you ever provided. We are financially, legally, and entirely severed." The silence that followed was absolute. It was not the tense, waiting silence of a coming argument, but the heavy final silence of a grave being filled. Richard could not speak. Eleanor could not weep. They were utterly paralyzed by the quiet, devastating destruction of their lifelong deception, executed without a single raised voice or thrown object. Alistair pushed himself off the stone mantel. He did not need to issue a threat. He merely took one slow, deliberate step forward, his immense physical presence filling the remaining space in the grand hall. "The gates of this estate are now permanently closed to you," my husband stated, his voice a low, geological rumble that vibrated through the stone floorboards. "If either of you ever attempts to contact my wife again, I will not simply ruin you financially. I will ensure you spend the rest of your natural lives in a federal penitentiary for the fraud you committed against Clara Sterling. Leave. They did not argue. They did not attempt to salvage their pride. Stripped of their stolen wealth and facing the terrifying, unyielding devotion of the man standing beside me, Richard and Eleanor Vance simply turned and fled. I watched the grand entryway doors close behind them, sealing them out in the cold wind, and for the first time in 20 years, the muscles in my back entirely relaxed. The phantom weight of their debt, the suffocating burden of my own supposed inadequacy, lifted from my shoulders and vanished into the winter air. The afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the Pacific, washing the interior of the Thorncroft estate in a brilliant, warm amber light. The harshness of the morning had completely dissolved, replaced by a profound echoing peace. The cloying artificial floral scent was gone, thoroughly scrubbed from the air by the deep, pervasive aroma of cedar, beeswax, and ancient paper. Alistair had disappeared into the lower levels of the estate shortly after the Vance family's departure. When he returned, he was carrying a large, flat wooden crate, handling it with the kind of meticulous reverence usually reserved for religious relics. He set it down in the center of the grand hall, right beneath the towering crescent window, where the light was purest. I walked over, my footsteps silent on the rugs, and watched as he carefully pried the wooden lid free. He pulled away layers of protective canvas and thick cotton padding, revealing a large, heavy frame made of gilded oak. I stopped breathing. It was an oil portrait. The colors were rich and deeply saturated, showing a woman with dark, intelligent eyes and a gentle, melancholic smile. She was sitting in a sunlit garden, her hands resting on a velvet-bound book. She wore a delicate silver pocket watch pinned to her bodice. It was Clara Sterling. I found it in the basement of the auction house. Richard used to liquidate the estate's original furnishings, Alistair said quietly, his gaze fixed on the canvas. I purchased it 10 years ago. It has been sitting in a climate-controlled vault in the city, waiting for the day I could finally bring it home. My chest ached, a sudden, fierce swelling of somatic solace that brought tears to the corners of my eyes. He had not just protected my future. He had meticulously hunted down the fragments of my stolen past, preserving my mother's dignity in the dark, while he waited for me to grow strong enough to claim it. Together, without needing to discuss the placement, we carried the heavy portrait to the prominent stone wall directly above the grand staircase. It was the very center of Thorncroft Manor, the first thing anyone would see upon entering the estate. We hung it precisely, making sure the heavy wire caught securely on the iron hooks. When we stepped back, my biological mother looked down upon the hall, her presence officially reclaiming the space, silently standing watch over the daughter she had fought so desperately to save. "She is beautiful," I whispered, wiping a single stray tear from my cheek. "She is exactly where she belongs," Alistair replied, his voice thick with a raw, unguarded emotion. As the evening approached, the temperature dropped, bringing the sharp, bracing chill of the ocean air. We moved away from the grand hall, walking side by side through the heavy mahogany doors that opened onto the estate's massive stone porch. The cliffs fell away dramatically beneath us, the dark, churning waters of the Pacific crashing rhythmically against the rocks below. There was a small, weathered wooden table, situated in the most sheltered corner of the porch, protected from the biting wind by a thick pane of architectural glass. Resting on the table was a delicate porcelain tea set, the surface of the cups painted with faint, trailing fern fronds. I did not wait for the estate staff. I did not ask Alistair to serve me. I stepped forward and took the heavy silver kettle, the heat radiating into my cold palms. It was a small, ordinary domestic ritual, but in the wake of the morning's monumental victory, it felt like the most profound action I could possibly take. I poured the steaming, fragrant chamomile tea into the fragile cups. I did not need to ask how he preferred it. After a month of watching him in the silent warmth of the archives, I knew his rhythms as intimately as my own. I added no sugar, knowing he despised the artificial sweetness, and instead stirred in a single, precise drop of local honey to cut the bitterness of the herbs. I handed him the cup, his large, calloused hands, the hands of a dock boy who had built an empire, the hands that bore the silver scars of survival, wrapped gently around the fragile porcelain. Our fingers brushed for a fraction of a second. The contact was brief, but it sent a sudden, startling wave of pure heat up my arm, melting away the final, lingering frost of my childhood isolation. We sat down on the wide wooden bench facing the ocean. We did not speak. We did not engage in loud, melodramatic declarations of eternal love, nor did we feel the need to fill the space with empty promises. The language we spoke was built on the undeniable proof of consistent, physical care. It was spoken in the scent of cedar, in the quiet return of a stolen diary, and in the perfect, steaming cup of tea resting in his hands. He shifted slightly, closing the small gap between us on the bench. His broad shoulder pressed lightly against mine, an anchor of solid, immovable warmth against the encroaching coastal chill. I leaned into him, letting the heavy weight of my head rest comfortably against his arm, finally surrendering the rigid posture I had maintained for 2 decades. He let out a long, slow breath, his chin resting gently against the top of my hair. The stoic Tycoon, the ruthless billionaire, who had terrified the local shipping magistrates, simply closed his eyes and breathed in the scent of lavender and sea salt. Home isn't a place or a name. It's a person. It is the person who leaves the door open just wide enough so that when you are finally ready to stop running, you can step inside without having to explain your scars. Alistair Thorncroft had built a fortress to protect me from the world, but in the end he had simply given me the keys and allowed me to choose him on my own terms. We were no longer bound by a transactional debt or a legal shield. We were equal guardians of history, sitting on the edge of the world, quietly authoring a new legacy from the splinters of the past. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. If you believe that the most powerful vows are the ones made in silence, and that true protection never demands a price, say please consider leaving a like on this video and subscribing to our channel. Your presence here makes this quiet sanctuary complete, and I will meet you there in the next one.